New methods, new weapons. We don't want intellectual scientists and so on. We are clear about the fact that these can only be men who are fanatical and believe in themselves.
Yes, the right choice of personalities. I've already spoken with Goebbels about this. He will support it extensively.
The most important thing is that the responsibility of the commanders is maintained. That's the trust that you, my Führer, have placed in him.
The guarantee is in the fact that we will really fill the NS officers' positions with the appropriate men. We just have to understand that only a very few of the officers will be suitable for this.
In 1943, after 2 years of savage war on the Eastern Front, and as the tide of war was changing, the Nazi German command finally decided to do what the Soviet Union did from the beginning, to mobilize all its resources, economical and industrial, in order to wage total war. In 1944, it also added new ideological policies and changes in the Wehrmacht with the aim of fanaticizing the troops in all army branches. Hitler had ordered the establishment of National Socialist Commanding Officers in the armed forces, in German Nationalsozialistische Führungsoffiziere, or NSFO. These were highly politicized officers, like the Red Army Commissars. It was regarded as important that some officers should have the responsibility of both military command and political instruction in the spirit of National Socialism. General Hermann Reinecke was named Chief of Staff in this new organization. These Führungsoffiziere had to be approved by a commission created by the leader of the Nazi Party Chancellery, Martin Bormann. This commission had to check whether the officers were flawless in the Nazi sense. General Reinecke reported his plans for the new office on the 7th of January 1944. During this meeting, Hitler presented his views about indoctrinating the armed forces with National Socialist ideology. The discussion that follows is very significant because it reflects both Hitler's continuing mistrust towards the attitude of the army and the inclination of leading generals to play up to the Commander-in-Chief of the armed forces. Interestingly, it also shows Hitler's concerns about the former Stalingrad generals speaking on the radio and the effect it could have on the troops fighting in the east. Many of the officers captured at Stalingrad joined the Free Germany Committee that was established by German communists in the USSR in 1943, and their leader was Walter von Seydlitz, former commander of the 51st Army Corps during the Battle on the Volga. Field Marshal Paulus later joined this organization. Make sure to watch our previous series dealing with this topic. This indoctrination highlights a major difference between the German and Soviet high commands, namely, the use by the Soviets of General Staff Studies. After each major operation, Stavka, the Soviet Supreme Command, would initiate a General Staff Study to assess what went wrong and what went right with the operation. The lessons learned were gradually integrated into the Red Army and thus improved the Army's operations. The OKW and OKH, on the other hand, were so imbued with a certain arrogance in their own military ethos, combined with Nazi ideology, they seem not to have considered such serious and methodical studies as necessary.
My Führer, I report most obediently my appointment as Chief of the National Socialist Operations Staff of the Armed Forces High Command. May I present to you the underlying concept of this matter? The assignments are very clearly outlined, and there is a uniform guidance of all the people in this area. Together with the party chancellery, all instructions and guidelines coming from you, my Führer, should go to the commanders-in-chief of the armies, the air forces, and so on. Always through the chain of command, just like all other orders. Everywhere, the NS officers must be made equal in position and importance to the tactical command personnel, and as such, their commanders must grant them the same rights as, for example, the operations officers, so that for all practical purposes, they have a position in the staff.
That's absolutely necessary!
I believe that must be the foundation. There must be a complete change in the meaning, so that externally it must be made clear that the war can be won through the ideology, attitude and orientation of all officers. New methods, new weapons.
There will be great resistance against it!
I am convinced that the assignment can only be carried out properly if all the men who are to take part in this area are personally selected and used in such a way that they can really master the assignments. We don't want intellectuals, scientists and so on.
They are totally useless and detrimental!
We are clear about the fact that these can only be men who are fanatical and believe in themselves, that this task must account for at least 50% of the entire command. I didn't want to suggest a vertical organization where there would be NS officers everywhere, guided vertically from above. Instead, it would be like it is in the tactical areas. Orders from all command positions down to the very bottom, except that the official in charge is the NS operations officer. I don't want a big bureaucracy here. Just a very small operations staff without any officials, only with men who already have practical experience in this field. First, there are some old political fighters and a few young officers who have already proven themselves with the same fanaticism. The political fighters we want to bring into the small operations staff should also have proven themselves at the front as a prerequisite. I've already received a long list of names from the party chancellery, and I've looked through it myself. They all have front awards, some very distinguished. They all have at least the Iron Cross, though they have all a significant front experience, which unfortunately was denied to me personally in this war. We can also save a lot of work that has already been done by the Waffen-SS. For example, if you also use it here. I already spoke with the Reichsleiter SS about it a few days ago. He promised to support me in all these areas, so that we can use much of what is already being done through in the Waffen-SS.
The guarantee is in the fact that we will really fill the NS officers' positions with the appropriate men.
Yes, mein Führer, we want to carry out a purge. We want to clear out the intellectuals from all these positions. There are many philologists in there, as I have recognized. They should come out. On the other hand, we won't be able to go any further than to the divisions, due to a lack of officers down in the regiments, battalions and companies. The tasks must be done on the side.
What guarantee do we have that the divisional commanders will really promote this matter positively and not look at the whole issue right away from the viewpoint of doing anything to kill it? I have experience in this field myself from my time as an education officer in the Reichswehr. There I saw myself what, for instance, a regimental commander or even a battalion commander can do, that he can totally kill a thing like this. We must not recoil from holding such commanders responsible for that, because one thing is critical. This thing makes sense only if it isn't considered a kind of private issue, which one can either do or not do, and above all, it must be made clear, right from the beginning, that any criticism and grumbling about orders issued in the ideological field will be punished, just the same as criticism of tactical or any other military matters, so that it will cost the officers their position and insignia. Everybody must know that it's not a matter of free will, and that he must not say, actually it's nonsense, I don't believe this, and so on. That can't happen. He can't say that about other things either. He can't criticize any order he receives, especially to his subordinates. But it happens in this area. I received dreadful news about that. The worst is in Hort's army, where Hort constantly criticizes all the ideological measures in the presence of the generals. That's why the 4th Panzer Army has had the worst attitude.
It's also necessary for the operations officer to work closely with the personnel officers and to communicate his observations to them. He also has to tell the commander, I have observed on my visits to the troops there and there that no one is taking care of these things.
The most important thing is that the responsibility of the commanders is maintained. The commander is the commissar. That's the trust that you, my Führer, have placed in him. Just as it is in the operational command, he must have someone responsible for this, since the General Staff Officer and the Intelligence Officer are totally busy with their own assignments. Someone who stands by his side, exactly like the Personnel Officer in personnel matters. The commander must also be responsible for the NS operations. Full cooperation is necessary between these three advisors to the commander. It's arranged like that within the headquarters. That's why it's also necessary that, just as the Chief of General Staff in the OKW is responsible to you for the entire tactical command, and just as I am responsible to you for the personnel policy in the Army, a person has to be identified in the Army who's responsible for the National Socialist operations. This person has, of course, to keep very close contact with General Zeitzler, since, in the end, the command of the field army is the most important thing, and we are jointly responsible to you personally for these things. So it becomes true what you, my Führer, declared in 1933, that the two fundamentals this state and our people are based on are, on the one hand, the party, and on the other hand, the armed forces. The officers and the commanders of the armed forces must also be just as much political ambassadors as the party officials, as you, my Führer, said before the young officers.
I'd like to add here that the instructions for the NS officers must outline all these problems very clearly, so that the NS operations officer won't become a politirok like in the Red Army. But on the other hand, he shouldn't speak to the troops like a preacher in the desert. Instead, he should consider it his goal to teach the officers the art of really leading the people in a political ideology way.
We just have to understand that only a very few of the officers will be suitable for this.
In the distant past, they received their wisdom in the Bible and from the drill regulations. As a consequence, they will also need some sort of drill regulations here, and that's the booklet, What Are We Fighting For?, with the order from you, my Führer, as an introduction.
First, one thing would be necessary, that we bring together the selected officers from the armies, the corps, and the divisions, and lead them through a 14-day course.
I had planned on that.
I will speak to them myself then.
I'd like to add a request to that, which is extremely urgent. Everyone will be trained and drilled, but the commanders are never brought together. The fact is that the workers always know more than the commanders themselves, and that's no good. So that's why this request that all generals, including the divisional commanders, be addressed once more by you, my Führer.
It's hard to get them together.
It must be possible, just like we got the adjutants together.
If it were possible, it would be the greatest success.
Let me explain here how we did the training in the party. To give you a picture of how difficult it actually is, when I established the party, the first training took place in the ongoing public meetings. These public meetings weren't really suitable for inner-party training, though, as they were somewhat influenced by the listeners we had. They were communists and so on, so it was difficult to make the final aims clear without being kicked out immediately. That's why we had the so-called speech evenings, with only those party members who were already absolutely convinced. In addition, there were special training sessions for the SA, which also had its own courses, in which presentations would be made. The SA commanders had their own course, which usually lasted 10 days. I spoke to the SA commanders personally, at least 3 to 4 times in these courses, and all the other leading men spoke there as well.
Absolutely, all the men. Everyone was there.
So we can say that there was such an enormous training effort that gradually identical conceptions were developed in all of them, so that if a second lieutenant falls in some phase of the battle, the other second lieutenant, who takes over the platoon, does exactly the same as the fallen one would have, or that if a captain falls, his substitute who takes over the command of the company also does the same as the other one would have done, or that if a regimental commander falls, The one who takes over the command does the same as the regimental commander would have done, because they've all had uniform training. We must reach that in this field too.
In order to support General Reinecke and the other participants here, we've already selected some of our people. Each of the formations and various offices will send one man to me who will be the official in charge, so that General Reinecke can really make use of all experiences of the party.
I mention this because it's the complete opposite of what happened in 1918. Back then it was real nonsense. This must spread out in uniforms way throughout the entire armed forces, which reaches all the way down, so that we can say, if an ideological problem arises, it will be dealt with the same way in the 4th Division as in the 162nd, and the same way there as anywhere else. They will all be trained uniformly, and will have the same views on all matters because they had the same basic training everywhere. That must be our ultimate goal.
Recently, we've also discussed all the material with Herrn Junge. He told me some very interesting things. It doesn't seem to be the way it's supposed to be everywhere. At least, I don't think we will get through to the troops with very long papers. Instead, we will bring along short and concise leaflets for the troops.
They especially have to take a stand on the issues that are critical at the moment. That was also the purpose of our speech evenings. During those evenings, the critical daily events were discussed from an ideological perspective, so that the people were trained on those issues. That's how the communist training used to be done as well.
We also wanted that this be done through the propaganda channel as well.
I've already spoken with Goebbels about this. He will support it extensively.
It just has to work. That's quite clear. The critical thing is that we find the right people.
Yes, the right choice of personalities. We had the Geleiters name all the people they thought appropriate, and asked the same of the Reichsleiters, unit commanders, and so on.
In the Great War, they did it in such a way that they turned the officer who wasn't good for anything else into a so-called education officer. We have to take the best people for that.
We will take all the people who are political fighters to Weimar together. They will come together now as company commanders, whatever they were. First they have to become familiar with our ideas. Then we want to select the most qualified ones, who will join the operation staff of the OKW and the 3 branches of the armed forces.
What General Schmutz said is correct. If we could win the commanders, we would arrive much faster. That's why we should consider getting the commanders together.
It will have to be a couple of times more often, since we can't get everyone together at once, but it would certainly work even if we only take the ones coming back from their leave. The commanders go on leave all the time too.
Certainly. They do go on leave all the time in a big rotation. But taking out the commanders of 60 divisions all at once will be hard.
We'll do the calculations and make a recommendation.
The most dangerous thing happening on the front right now. The appeals coming from General Seydlitz. It comes under a black, white, red flag, and the man doesn't know, is it true or not? It comes from officers, and the man so far had the opinion that officers are men of honor. That man isn't aware that a number of such swine exist. There's no doubt that these are not the people who are acting under pressure. These people are not just being pushed forward. They're acting on their own. One just needs to read their writings. I know the dialects very well. If I get an appeal today from someone, I can tell right away if it comes from the Reich Marshal or from Goebbels, just like my people know my diction very well. My old party comrades told me immediately, "You wrote that yourself?" When I asked, "How do you know that?" I was pointed to a few sentences. You can recognize immediately whether something has been done by a general staff officer. We can't get around it anymore. If we maintain the approach that they are acting under pressure, we might get rebuked very unpleasantly if they go out and speak more sharply on the radio. No one will believe anymore that they're acting under pressure, or we could say that those are some characterless pigs who let themselves be bought. In other cases, we can just be repudiated. What can we do if they go out and speak over the radio? They already talk on the radio all the time anyway. It's a matter of great concern. If someone goes out and tells his own people, if we lose the war, we'll experience a wonderful renewal together with the Russians, that's a crime, an unparalleled disaster. They've removed their Tukhachevsky, and such an idiot like Seydlitz thinks that he'll remain then. Those creatures are dumb, or is it a lack of character that's completely without bounds? Usually both together. We have to take a position against it.
I'd like to address two more points here, my Führer. You brought up with the Field Marshal the issue of the German salute for the armed forces.
Two things will be done on January 30th. The regimental flags will be taken down, and the German salute will be introduced from the armed forces.
I thought that if we are so attached to tradition, we could latch onto Friedrich the Great and reintroduce the old salute that was used back then. That's a tradition from a time when Prussia was at war.
I don't think that's the most important thing. They all know that very well. The point is that there are still many officers who have always saluted that way, from their time as cadets up to Field Marshal, and they'll find it strange if they have to salute differently now. The important thing is that it will not be issued as a military order. Attention! As of tomorrow, use the German salute.
That must be done in the context of a total standardization of the armed forces, party, and so on.
The other point, which concerns the regimental flags, is absolutely clear.
Yes, today there is only one ideological flag. No unit flag anymore. Every other state in the world fights under its own tricolor, its star-spangled banner, and so on. Only we have the unit flags.
That's why I wanted to suggest that we only display those flags that have been under fire. The flags of 1870 and 1914. Nothing else is of interest.
At first, we didn't want any flags at all, but when the rumor circulated that I intended to introduce the swastika, General Fitch did it all very quickly. The only branch of the armed forces that resisted was the Kriegsmarine. The Luftwaffe was enthusiastic because it now has the hope of being able to go further than others with decoration and embroider. Considering the great future tasks, we can only come out of this battle as absolutely united ideologically.
By the end of the year 1944, about 47,000 secondary and 1,100 primary NSFO participated in central training courses. In regiments and battalions, officers took NSFO functions as side duties. Up to the division level, NSFO were provided to commanders and placed under their authority. At the company level, unit commanders took up the function of NSFOs. Their teaching courses indoctrinated hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of men drafted into the Wehrmacht with anti-Semitic propaganda. But the real impact was way less significant than the Nazi leaders had wanted. The implementation of this program inside the Wehrmacht was met with indifference or inefficiency at best, and in many cases with resistance and resentment. There were jealousies between the staff officers in OKW and OKH, and members of the military structure did not always come along with instructions from the party. But a primary cause for those tensions was the personal dislike and lack of respect which members of the NSFO staff showed towards their homologues in the army. As a result, the goals were not attained, and the project failed. The Wehrmacht remained largely an apolitical structure until the end of the war.